In the news, a jazzy newcomer in music. Jazz musicians have won fame blowing trumpets, saxophones, even flutes. But here's a jazz artist who's whistling his way to fame. We'll be back with Ron McCroby in the news.
Sponsored by Big Crunchy Honeycomb, the cereal of the Honeycomb Kid.
Hello and welcome to the Whistling Podcast. My name is Antoine Plohicho. Today I'm going to talk about the whistler that really got me interested in whistling as an art. That whistler is Ron McCroby. I started playing jazz while I was learning to play clarinet and saxophone in junior high school. A friend's neighbor turned me on to Pete Fountain and inspired an interest in Dixieland jazz. That music still stirs something in my soul. The first real saxophone player that gave me a warm feeling was John Clemmer, although I don't find that his music stands the test of time for me. I can't really remember how I started whistling or how. I suppose it was just something I picked up from classmates and it developed over time. I played in the high school jazz band, playing baritone sax and clarinet, inspired mostly by Benny Goodman and Jerry Mulligan. At that time in the late 80s, the Multnomah County Library in Portland had a pretty great collection of jazz records, and I would check out albums and listen to them, the liner notes guiding me on to greater and greater discoveries. I believe that it was in high school that I first checked out a Ron McCroby album. About the same time I started staying up late to watch Johnny Carson, David Letterman, and Bob Costas. I'm pretty sure that I would have seen Ron McCroby on Johnny Carson, but I don't really know if I'm fabricating a false history. Anyhow, the library had the album Ron McCroby Plays the Puckalo. It inspired me to whistle along to jazz albums and try to imitate jazz solos with whistling. That's my history with Ron McCroby. So let's start out with some background on Ron McCroby. It's a little disturbing that Ron doesn't have a Wikipedia page in English, although he does have one in Dutch, and Europeans seem to appreciate jazz more than Americans do. Ronald Abbot McCroby was born on October 19, 1933. Every article about Ron McCroby's life mentions that he was the son of a barber, a noble profession. He was raised in Morgantown, West Virginia. He learned music with a former member of John Philip Sousa's orchestra and played clarinet, saxophone, and flute. I don't find any mention of his piano playing, but in some of the videos that are out on YouTube, he seems to be a pretty competent piano player as well. He had his big moment in high school when the piccolo player was sick. I'm going to let Ron McCroby tell as much of the story as I can.
Kid who played the piccolo part on the Stars and Stripes Forever, he was sick that night. So I sat in my chair, laid my clarinet down, and went and whistled the piccolo part along with the whole band. Nobody knew.
Ron majored in composition at West Virginia University. He married Barbara Morrison, his childhood sweetheart, before he graduated. He moved with his new family to Cincinnati about 1955, when his wife accepted a job with a Ford Motor Company. He first worked for Duolite, making signs, but quickly found his career in advertising for the Sive Advertising Company as a writer. Soon he was writing commercials for major clients, including Kenner Toys. Eventually he was named creative vice president and worked there until 1985, except for 2 years with Osmond Studios. While he was working by day as an ad executive, he played as an amateur clarinetist, saxophonist, and flautist in jazz groups, and directed the local choir. In 1981, the University of Cincinnati made a student film, The Jazz Whistler, where Ron tells the story of what started it all off.
This is a significant change from the career you've had as a musician, as a writer of jingles and all this. How did it all start, please?
Well, my wife said to me about 15 months ago, gee, you've whistled on jingles, occasionally on jazz jobs. You would put your horn down and whistle a chorus or two, and everybody liked it. Why don't you try this? Why don't you go for it, for real? And I said, come on, everybody will laugh. I mean, a guy up there whistling. But she encouraged me and said, well, give it a shot. Try it once. And I did, under great duress, knowing that everyone would laugh. Nobody laughed. Nobody laughed. So I started getting confidence in this thing, and the more I did it, the more it seemed that people really liked it. And so it's just taken off like crazy.
In that same year, his wife videotaped Ron whistling and sent it to PM Magazine, a Cincinnati evening news show. The news segment won an award, and more television appearances followed, including The Merv Griffin Show, where he caught the attention of Monterey Jazz Festival's founder, Jimmy Lyons.
The first thing I did, I guess, publicly before a large audience was the Monterey Jazz Festival. And that was a great reception I received there. And so that said to me, hey, people see that I am serious about what I'm doing.
Ron McCroby made his first appearance on the Johnny Carson Show sometime in 1982 as well.
I make it more exciting. He is really a jazz...
He's a jazz whistler.
Right.
And he does incredible things, but it's called...
Like an instrument.
Beg your pardon?
It's very similar to an instrument, what he does.
Yes,
Yes, yeah.
By forming his mouth, a certain way he whistles, and it sounds almost like...
That makes it more interesting. There's a whistling. Some guy go out and... It's over,
Ron McCroby coined his own term for his particular art form.
When I first started, I figured I needed a handle of some sort on this, and I figured, well, I have to pucker to do it. It sounds like a piccolo, so I'll coin a word, and I call it the puccolo.
Ron McCroby talks more about his art.
As I hear you do this, Ron, the lines are so long, and I thought I detected a reversal of the airstream. Is that part of the equipment?
It is, yeah. I whistle both out and in, and if I get to a spot where I think I need a little breath, I'll just do a line, some configuration on the way back in, pick up a little more air, and then just much as a violinist, down bows, and so I do it the same way.
And there's no change in the sound?
No, I don't think there is. I don't think it's perceivable when you hear me. Okay. There are no buttons that I'm pushing. It's just all happening. I am the instrument.
Do you practice this kind of thing? Do you practice scales, arpeggios, like you did on your clarinet or flute?
Do I go? No. I don't sit around and do that. I sit at the piano sometimes and just, and that just for fun, but no, I don't make a concerted effort to.
Being a woodwind player, we think in patterns. And do you have something going through your mind? This isn't purely abstract. This can't be purely abstract.
No, when I do, especially when I do ballads, I think a lot about how that would be on the instrument and what the patterns would be and so forth. But when I go fast, if I try to think of that, I realize that I probably wouldn't be able to do that on my instrument. So I cut that loose and I forget about all these fingering patterns on up-tempo things.
And you're not thinking necessarily flute or clarinet or alto sax?
No. If I think anything, it would be clarinet. Because that's the instrument I'm more comfortable with, what I grew up with. So I'd think on clarinet.
Okay.
I have to say, yeah. When I'm performing, it's not thinking funny. I'm very busy concentrating, so I'm pretty well wrapped up in what I'm doing.
You'd prefer to work with the rhythm section and...
Yeah, I like a rhythm section. I like kind of a quiet, understated rhythm section, a guitar, bass and drums, or Fender Rhodes, bass and drums. It seems to suit what I'm doing a little better.
In August 1983, Ron appeared at the Concord Jazz Festival, and in that same year, he released his first album, Ron McCroby Plays Puccolo. His second album was released in 1984, The Other Whistler. During this time, he also made many other appearances on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. In 1985, he moved to Chagrin Falls, Ohio, and took a position in print advertising with Little Tykes Company. Ron McCroby released a third album in 1985, breeze in the classics with the Orion Consort, an album of mostly classical music.
Do you do anything else besides jazz? Classical, Broadway, country music?
I do classical. I did a flute recital a little while back and did the Telemann Sonata in F. It was fun.
Pure classical music?
Yeah, pure
You don't try
classical.
to add a jazz lick in there?
No. I read it right from the music. I do it as it is. Yeah,
And it's, the whole aesthetic experience is classical
absolutely.
in every way. Okay.
Yeah, all the interpretation.
What's your next project? What's in the fire?
The next thing I'm going to Monterey in September to do the Monterey Jazz Festival. It's their 25th anniversary. I'm going to be working with people I've admired for years. Mundell Lowe on guitar, Shelly Manne on drums, Rufus Reed on bass, John Lewis on piano, and I'm working with a jazz bassoonist, Ray Peasy. Me, him.
That's going
And
to be nice.
I'm going to do a tune there. Whistle while you work.
With concert dates and record offers, McCroby seems to have many opportunities to stay wrapped up in his whistling.
After that, he became semi-retired from his old job, working as a consultant and running his own jingle company, Ram Productions. He lent his voice to several ad campaigns, notably the Tender Heart Bear for the Care Bears series of greeting cards, as well as the Winnie the Pooh video game. Some other campaigns that he worked on were for Play-Doh and Wendy's. He retired from the advertising business in 1998. After his brief time in the spotlight, it seems that life slowed down a bit, although he seems to have still been whistling. His final album was recorded in Holland, Two Lips from Holland, released in 2001. On August 5th, 2002, the jazz world got some bad news.
Musician and self-described puckalist Ronald McCroby. He died on Monday at the age of 68.
He was survived by his wife, one son, Ronald Scott McCroby, 5 daughters, Pamela, Laura, Holly, Pollyann, and Sarah. He had 7 grandchildren. Other than whistling, his hobbies were calligraphy and magic. So Ronald Abbot McCroby, that was your life. Thank you for your inspiration.
I'm Christopher Glenn with a jazz whistler in the news.
It is an art form, and I hope that I will become known for that, and that it's not a gag thing, that I really am serious about this.
And now let's talk about his albums. Before we discuss Ron McCroby's albums, I would like to mention a website called whistlingrecords.net. You can stream Ron McCroby's first 3 albums on there. You can also pay a one-time $10 fee and download all the albums for your personal collection. Ron McCroby's last album, Two Lips from Holland, which was recorded in Holland, is a little bit harder to find. But if you have your VPN set to Holland, you can listen to it on YouTube. I would like to say I'm not sponsored in any way by whistlingrecords.net. I just wanted to mention it for anyone interested in the history of recorded whistling. It's a great resource. All right, well, let's begin with Ron McCroby's first album, Ron McCroby Plays Puccolo, recorded in December 1982 at Coast Recorders, San Francisco, California. Released in 1983. The musicians are Ron McCroby, puccolo and clarinet, Sam Most, flute, Bill Mays, piano, Bob Magnuson, bass, and Jeff Hamilton, drums. The album opens with the standard Joy Spring, written by Clifford Brown. What is especially nice to me is the sound of whistling and flute together as heard on the head. Right after that, Ron shows his soloing skills. Another nice thing about this track is Bill Mays playing Fender Rhodes. The second track is If You Could See Me Now, written by Tad Dameron and Carl Sigman. And move on to track 3, Lion for Lions, written by Jerry Mulligan. This was one of my favorite tunes to play back when I was playing in a jazz group. Ron McCroby plays clarinet on this track, and even though I'm a clarinet player and a big fan of jazz clarinet, I'm going to skip this one. You can listen to the Clarinet podcast for discussion of that track, even though I doubt that anyone is discussing Ron McCroby's clarinet playing. We move on to the last track of side 1, which is Puckle While You Work, written by Frank Churchill and Larry Morey. This is a reworking of Whistle While You Work, and it's quite a nice arrangement. Side 2 begins with another Clifford Brown tune, Dahoud. Even though Ron McCroby is a woodwind player, I seem to hear a lot of trumpet-like phrasing in his solos. It seems apparent that he listened to a lot of Clifford Brown. Second track on side 2 is Everything Happens to Me, written by Tom Adair and Matt Dennis. I'm not a big fan of jazz ballads, but hearing the warm sound of the Fender Rhodes alone with the whistling is nice. The third track on side 2 is Boplicity, written by Cleo Henry. This was my favorite track off the Smithsonian Collection of Classic Jazz, as performed by Miles Davis and his orchestra. And the last track of the album is Along Came Betty, written by Benny Golson. We'll begin with Ron McCroby's solo. And in the melody, played by Sam Most and Ron McCroby. Some nice trading fours, and the final fade out. And that concludes Ron McCroby Plays the Puckalo. All right, we're going to move on now to Ron McCroby's second album, The Other Whistler, released in 1984. The players on this album are Ron McCroby, puckalo and clarinet, Bill Mays returns to play acoustic and electric piano, Steve LaSpina bass, and Akira Tanna drums. The first track on this album is Four Brothers, written by Jimmy Guthrie. Ryan Bromberg did a version of this on his 2006 album, Wood 2, and later on we may do a comparison. But let's move on to the second track of this album, Song from MASH, written by Johnny Mandel and Mike Altman. It's a strange inclusion on an album, although now I realize that MASH had its final episode on February 28, 1983. At the time of this album's release, it would have been fresh in everyone's mind. Track 3 is Cherokee by Ray Noble. I like the double time section, and Ron McCroby does a nice fast solo on this one. The last track on side 1 is My Foolish Heart, written by Ned Washington and Victor Young. This was one of my favorite tracks off of the Tony Bennett and Bill Evans album. Beginning side 2 is Blue Rondo a la Turk, written by Dave Brubeck. This is a great version. Double whistling is actually a thing, but I don't think Ron McCroby is actually double whistling on this song. He seems to have double tracked it, and I think on this album this might be his best solo. next track is I Remember Clifford by Benny Golson. I remember playing this song and it taking about 30 minutes to get through the melody, but Ron McCroby does a nice version. He has a lot of Clifford Brown songs on these two albums, and I can see that he was influenced a lot by Clifford Brown's trumpet playing. Ron McCroby needed to sell albums, and who doesn't want to hear the theme from the Andy Griffith Show? This track is called Mayberry RFD, written by Herbert Spencer. It's a very nice version of the song, and once more he double tracks the whistling. The last song on the album is Take 5, written by Paul Desmond. You may know that Dave Brubeck's Time Out album is one of the top-selling jazz albums of all time, and Ron McCroby has two songs from that album represented on here. Ron McCroby plays clarinet on this track, and since I haven't given you a taste of his clarinet playing so far, I thought I would on this song. I like this song no matter who is playing it. So my final thoughts on this album are, I like this one better than the first album, although I do miss the interplay with Sam most. The choice of songs is much better on this album, and it makes for a much more exciting listening experience. So we now move on to Ron McCroby's third album, Breeze in the Classics, recorded May 1985 at QCA Studios, Cincinnati, Ohio. On this album, Ron McCroby is backed by the Orion Consort, Pamela Watson flute, piccolo, and alto flute, Christopher Philpotts, oboe, English horn, recorder, and guitar, Susan Marshall Peterson, cello, Judith Larson, harpsichord, flute, and piano, and also with Richard Jensen, percussion. This album is Ron McCroby's attempt at classical music. The first track is The Entertainer by Scott Joplin. love The Entertainer. I wouldn't call it classical, but, well, it is a favorite. I remember a time when every piano had the sheet music to The Entertainer. Probably one of the most popular piano pieces of all time. We now move on to track 2, Carnival of Venice. I want to begin by giving you a little taste of how good the Orion Consort sounds. And now Ron McCroby is whistling. Track 3 is another classical favorite, Canon by Johann Pachelbel. Track 4 stretches the bounds of what we consider classical, although I suppose you can take classics as having a different meaning. Track 4 is Stephen Sondheim's Send in the Clowns. I remember in the 80s this being one of the most popular jazz ballads to hear. Number 5 is Hornpipe from the Water Music by George Friedrich Handel. That ends Side 1. Side 2 begins with Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's Rondo alla Turca. Track 2 of Side 2 is Gabriel Fares' Pavane. Track 3, Menuet from the Quintet for Guitar and Strings by Luigi Boccherini. Track 4, George Gershwin's Summertime. The album ends with George Philip Telemann's Sonata in F, which seems to have been one of Ron McCroby's favorites. So I left my commentary mostly to the end. My taste in classical music is a bit more moody, like Gustav Mahler and Franz Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsodies. It's a fine album, but I think I'm more of a fan of the Orion Consort on this album, and not so much of Ron McCroby. Ron McCroby is definitely at his best when puckling jazz. I'm not sure if this album was recorded live or if Ron McCroby added his parts in later, but at times it seems like he's not quite in sync with the rest of the musicians. That might just be a defect in my ear. It also seems at times he's a little bit out of tune. There was about a 15-year gap after this last classical album of Ron McCroby's, and his final album was called Ron McCroby with the Hans Mantell Trio, Two Lips from Holland. A very clever title. Released in 2001, a year before Ron McCroby's death. The musicians on that album are Hans Mantell bass, Wim Kegel drums, and Berend Vandenberg piano. This album is not easy to find, although it can be bought online. There are a few videos of these performances on YouTube, and I'll leave links in the notes. I'm going to leave listening to that album as homework for my listeners. The 3 previous albums, as I said before, can be streamed on whistlingrecords.net, and for a $10 fee you can download the albums for your collection as well as a lot of other Whistling records. For now, I'm going to sign off and leave you until next time on the Whistling Podcast.
Call action. A call to action. Call action. Call to action.
A call to action.
A call to action. A call to action.
You can join the Whistling Podcast group on Facebook. I now have a website, thewhistlingpodcast.com. You can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/The Whistling Podcast. And I also have a Quora site for discussions, thewhistlingpodcastspace.quora.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time on the Whistling Podcast.
I listened to music all day the other day.
Yeah.
It was fun. I found this website called It was called whistlingrecords.net, and it's the online guide to whistling records. And they have pretty much a decent, pretty solid category of whistling records. So it's just like people whistling, and they have all sorts of styles of whistles. They have one album by this guy, Fred Lowry, and it says the title of the album was They'll Be Whistling and Singing in Heaven. He has another album called Walking Along and Kicking the Leaves.
This reminds me of Guns N' Roses' Patience.
Is the whistle in it?
The whole beginning is him just whistling.
Can you whistle well?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, that was pretty good.
I was whistling Patience for our listeners.
Yeah, but I got all into these whistlers, man. The best one that I liked, he's also a singer, but his name is Roger Whittaker. There's one guy, a whistler, his name is Toots.
I honestly can't believe you dedicated a lot of time to listening to a whistling website.
Why don't you like whistling? Like, it's an instrument.
You know what? Marissa hates whistling. So
Oh, she should listen to Breezin' the Classics with Ron McCroby, and she'd love it. Breezin' the Classics. Yeah, it's one I'd like to, turn you on to as a beginner.
All right, you ready to get out of here?
Yeah, let's do it. Hey, thanks so much for joining us here on episode number 89.